Hello, I'm Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, a past administration called the old North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, the worst of all trade agreements, and we agreed. NAFTA was then renegotiated and rewritten and given a new name, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. Now, the new USMCA made no changes whatsoever to the trade in cattle and beef. So the new USMCA is still the old NAFTA for the U.S. cattle industry. And now the new administration says it wants to make the USMCA work. So how do we tell a good trade agreement from a bad one? Well, in very general terms, a good trade agreement should give an industry the opportunity to sell products in new markets, where they would then compete for market share in those new markets. A good one should also make it possible to obtain products from foreign countries that we either don't make here or that help create competition for products that we do make here, but not in sufficient quantities to give consumers real choices. Now, a trade agreement that doesn't do those things, such as one with limited opportunities to sell more products and that doesn't create a competitive market even when you can sell products, or one that simply facilitates more imports of the same products we are producing here without providing the opportunity to compete against those products, thus not affording consumers any real choices, would certainly not be a good trade agreement. So enter the USMCA, which is the subject of a letter that 18 national, state, and regional cattle associations, including RCAF USA, sent to U.S. Trade Ambassador Katherine Tai and Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack. You see, news reports indicate that Ambassador Tai is soon to hold a summit with her counterparts in Mexico and Canada, and the purpose of the summit is presumably to make the USMCA work. The 18 cattle groups are asking for relief from the USMCA. So here's the basis of the letter. It points out that the USMCA is causing more harm to the domestic live cattle supply chain and all of America's rural communities that are supported by that supply chain than any other multilateral trade agreement. The letter provides graphs showing that the trade in cattle and beef between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is way out of balance, with the United States importing 2.5 times the value of the same cattle and beef products that it exports, and it imports 3.5 times the quantity of the same type of cattle and beef that it exports. The graphs also show that these imbalances have worsened over the past several years. In other words, far more imported cattle and beef are entering the U.S. market from Canada and Mexico than ever before. And for an industry as sensitive to supply increases, as is our U.S. cattle industry, this is bad news. So why do so many others in our domestic cattle and beef industries continue touting the USMCA as a good agreement for the cattle industry? Well, it's not. But it's a dandy of an agreement if you are a multinational beef packer, processor, or importer. That's because those multinational companies can profit by buying lower priced beef and cattle from Mexico and Canada, and yet sell the final product in the U.S. market for the same price that a domestic product would command. Of course, that's only made possible because there are no labels on the imported beef to differentiate domestic from imported product. Now, those same multinational companies can also import millions of head of lower-priced foreign cattle from Mexico and Canada with which to increase cattle supplies in the U.S. marketplace, thus putting downward pressure on domestic cattle prices. And this lowers the price that they have to pay for all their cattle purchases, thus increasing their profit margins. So if the multinational beef packers, processors, and importers are the clear winners in this lopsided trade, who are the losers? Well, that should be pretty clear. The losers are U.S. cattle producers who want a fair and competitive price for their cattle and America's rural communities that depend on a prosperous U.S. cattle industry for their economic cornerstones. The 18 groups letter urges the United States to take decisive action to put an end to these chronically out of balance trade flows with Mexico and Canada, and as a first step, to empower U.S. cattle producers to begin competing with these massive imports by differentiating their superior product. And of course, that will require the return of mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. So help us convince this new administration and Congress that the emperor, in this case the USMCA, simply has no clothes. And please go to our website at r-cafusa.com to learn more and to join with us so we can truly restore the lost competition in our U.S. cattle market. With that, have a productive week. Thank you and goodbye.